The night of December 6, 1991, began like any other Friday in Austin, Texas. The city was bustling with the start of the weekend, and Christmas lights were beginning to twinkle across the neighborhoods. Inside a small, cheerful yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. Located in a North Austin strip mall, two teenage girls were finishing up their evening shift. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, both 17, were looking forward to closing up and heading home. It was a popular spot for local kids, a place of innocent fun and frozen treats. No one could have imagined that this ordinary night was about to descend into one of the city's darkest and most enduring mysteries. As the clock ticked past 10 p.m., Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Harbison, and her best friend, Amy Ayers, arrived at the shop. Sarah was 15 and Amy was just 13. The two younger girls had been at the nearby North Cross Mall and decided to stop by to get a ride home with Jennifer. The four girls were now together, likely chatting and laughing as the shop prepared to close its doors for the night. They were at the cusp of their lives, full of plans and dreams for the future. The simple act of waiting for a ride home became the final, tragic moments of their young lives, a detail that would haunt their families and the city for decades to come. Just before midnight, an Austin police officer on patrol noticed smoke billowing from the roof of the yogurt shop. He immediately called the fire department, thinking it was a routine business fire. Firefighters arrived quickly, ready to battle the blaze. They forced their way through the locked front door and were met with thick black smoke and intense heat. As they worked to extinguish the flames, they began to navigate the small space, their visibility limited and their senses overwhelmed. The initial assumption of a simple fire was about to be shattered by a discovery so horrifying it would be seared into the memory of every first responder on the scene that night. Through the haze and the charred debris, a firefighter made the first grim discovery. It was the body of a young girl. Soon after, 3 more were found. The scene was far more sinister than a simple fire. The flames had been intentionally set to cover up a brutal and vicious crime. The 4 teenage girls, who had been laughing and talking just hours before, were found in the back of the shop. Their lives had been stolen in an act of unimaginable cruelty. The news would soon spread, sending a shockwave of fear and disbelief through Austin, a city that had always considered itself a safe haven. This was not just a fire, it was a massacre. The 4 victims were more than just names in a tragic headline. They were daughters, sisters, and friends, each with a unique spark. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were sisters, bound by a close and loving relationship. Jennifer, the older sister at 17, was a responsible and caring young woman who worked at the yogurt shop. She was known for her kindness and her protective nature, especially toward her younger sister. Friends remembered her as someone you could always count on, a steady presence with a warm smile. She was finishing her senior year of high school with all the excitement and promise that time of life holds. Her future was a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with color. Sarah Harbison, at 15, was bright and full of youthful energy. She looked up to her older sister, Jennifer, and loved spending time with her. That Friday night, she was with her best friend, Amy, just being a typical teenager. She was an innocent girl, caught in the wrong place at the most terrible time. Friends described her as sweet and a little shy, but with a fun-loving spirit that shone through when she was with people she trusted. The fact that she and her sister were taken together added an extra layer of heartbreak to an already incomprehensible tragedy, leaving their family to navigate a grief that was twofold and all-consuming. Eliza Thomas, 17, was Jennifer's co-worker and friend. She was known for her intelligence, her artistic talents, and her thoughtful nature. Eliza had a passion for life and a deep curiosity about the world around her. She was a student at Austin High School, where she was well liked by her peers and respected by her teachers. She had plans to attend college and explore her many interests. Her family remembered her as a vibrant and compassionate person who brought joy to everyone she knew. Her presence was a light, and her absence would leave a permanent void in the lives of all who loved her. The youngest of the four was 13-year-old Amy Ayers. She was a vibrant and outgoing 8th grader at Burnett Middle School, full of the boundless energy and optimism of early adolescence. Amy was Sarah Harbison's best friend, and the two were inseparable. She was described as a happy-go-lucky girl who loved music and spending time with her friends. Her life was just beginning, filled with sleepovers, school dances, and dreams of what she would become. Her innocence makes her death feel particularly cruel. The loss of these 4 girls, each with so much potential and life left to live, was a devastating blow that the community would never fully recover from. When first responders finally managed to clear the smoke from the yogurt shop, the full extent of the horror was revealed. The scene they uncovered was one of calculated brutality. The 4 girls were found in the rear of the store, their bodies positioned in a way that spoke to the killer's absolute control over them. They had been bound with their own clothing, their hands tied behind their backs. Strips of cloth had been used to gag them, silencing their cries in their final terrifying moments. The methodical nature of the restraints suggested a level of cold-blooded planning that was deeply unsettling to even the most seasoned investigators who arrived at the scene. The initial examination of the victims revealed that each girl had been shot in the head, execution style. The use of 2 different caliber firearms, a .22 and a .380, indicated that there were likely at least 2 perpetrators involved in the crime. The killers had not only murdered the girls, but had also taken steps to degrade and humiliate them. They had been forced to undress, and their bodies were discovered nude or partially nude. This, combined with other evidence, strongly suggested that sexual assault was a component of the attack, adding another layer of depravity to an already monstrous act. The scene was a quiet testament to the terror the girls must have endured. The fire, which had alerted authorities to the crime, was clearly an act of arson. The perpetrators had stacked chairs and other items on top of the victims' bodies and used a lighter fluid to set the pile ablaze. Their goal was obvious: to destroy any evidence that could link them to the crime. The intense heat and flames caused significant damage to the shop and, more critically, to the bodies of the girls. This act of destruction complicated the work of forensic investigators from the very beginning, making it incredibly difficult to collect fingerprints, fibers, or other trace evidence that might lead them to the killers. The fire was a final, defiant act of cruelty. Investigators pieced together a chilling timeline of what they believed happened that night. After the last customer left, at least 2 men entered the shop, possibly under the pretense of a robbery. They quickly overpowered the 4 teenagers, using the threat of violence to control them. The girls were herded to the back room, where they were bound, gagged, and assaulted. Then, one by one, they were shot. The killers then set the fire and fled, leaving behind a scene of carnage designed to conceal their identities. The sheer brutality of the crime was shocking, and it left the entire city of Austin wondering what kind of monsters could be living among them. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, the Austin Police Department launched one of the largest and most complex investigations in the city's history. Detectives were inundated with tips from a terrified public, and every lead, no matter how small, was pursued with urgency. The entire community was on edge, with parents holding their children closer and the sense of safety that had once defined Austin completely shattered. The pressure to find the killers was immense, coming from the grieving families, the media, and a city demanding answers and justice for the 4 young girls whose lives had been so violently cut short. Early in the investigation, suspicion fell on several individuals, but one group of teenagers soon became the primary focus. 4 young men, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were brought in for questioning. The boys were known to frequent the North Cross Mall area and had been there on the night of the murders. Maurice Pierce was arrested at the mall just days after the crime for carrying a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber as one of the murder weapons. Although ballistics tests later proved it was not the same gun, the connection was enough to place him and his friends under intense police scrutiny. Despite hours of interrogation, police were unable to gather enough evidence to charge any of the 4 teenagers at the time. The young men all denied any involvement in the murders, and with no physical evidence linking them to the crime scene, investigators were at a dead end. Forrest Wellborn even passed a polygraph test, further complicating the case against the group. For years, the investigation stalled. Leads dried up and the case grew cold, though it never left the minds of the detectives assigned to it or the families who waited day after day for a breakthrough. The yogurt shop murders became Austin's most infamous unsolved crime. The case remained dormant for years, a painful open wound for the city. Detectives continued to review the files, hoping to find something they had missed. They re-interviewed witnesses and explored other theories, including the possibility that the murders were connected to other crimes in the area. One theory involved 2 unidentified men who were reportedly seen inside the yogurt shop shortly before closing time, but they were never located. The lack of progress was frustrating for everyone involved, and it seemed as though the killers might never be found. The passage of time did nothing to lessen the pain of the loss or the public's desire for justice. Nearly 8 years after the murders, in 1999, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Detectives, armed with new interrogation strategies, decided to re-interview the original suspects. They brought Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen in for questioning once again. This time, after hours of intense, psychologically taxing interrogations, both men confessed to their involvement in the yogurt shop murders. Scott's confession came first, followed by Springsteen's. In their statements, they implicated themselves and the other 2 original suspects, Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn. It seemed, at long last, that the case was finally solved. The confessions were detailed and contained information that, at first glance, seemed to match the evidence from the crime scene. The men described how the robbery went wrong, leading to the murder of the 4 girls. Their stories appeared to corroborate each other, providing a coherent narrative of the horrific events of that night. For the police and the prosecution, these confessions were the breakthrough they had been waiting for. They believed they finally had the evidence they needed to bring the perpetrators to justice and provide closure for the victims' families. The city of Austin breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the monsters were finally caught. However, the confessions were not as solid as they first appeared. Almost as soon as they were made, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen recanted their statements. They claimed that the confessions had been coerced, that they were the result of intense psychological pressure and manipulation by the police. They argued that detectives had fed them details of the crime, which they then repeated back. Their lawyers contended that the young men, exhausted and intimidated, had simply told the police what they wanted to hear in order to make the grueling interrogations stop. This raised serious questions about the validity of the central pieces of evidence against them. The issue of coerced confessions became the heart of the legal battle that followed. Defense attorneys pointed to the long, grueling hours of questioning and the psychological tactics used by the interrogators. They highlighted inconsistencies within the confessions and between the 2 men's stories. For example, details about who shot whom and with which weapon did not always align. The fact that the confessions were obtained without lawyers present for much of the interrogation also raised red flags. The case, which had seemed so close to being solved, was once again plunged into a world of doubt and uncertainty. Despite the recanted confessions, prosecutors decided to move forward with the case. In 2001, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were put on trial for the capital murder of the 4 girls. The trials were separate and highly publicized, capturing the attention of the entire state. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on the confessions. They argued that the statements contained details that only the true killers could have known, a concept known as guilty knowledge. Prosecutors painted a picture of the two men as cold-blooded killers who had finally admitted to their heinous crimes, and they asked the juries to deliver the ultimate punishment. The defense teams fought back fiercely, arguing that their clients were innocent victims of a flawed investigation. They presented expert testimony on the phenomenon of false confessions, explaining how individuals can be pressured into admitting to crimes they did not commit. They meticulously picked apart the confessions, showing the juries how detectives may have unintentionally or intentionally supplied the suspects with non-public information about the crime scene. They argued that without any physical evidence connecting Scott or Springsteen to the yogurt shop, the confessions alone were not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom became a battleground over memory, psychology, and police procedure. Ultimately, the juries found the confessions compelling. In separate trials, both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen were found guilty of capital murder. Springsteen was sentenced to death, while Scott received a sentence of life in prison. Charges against Forrest Wellborn and Maurice Pierce were eventually dropped due to a lack of evidence. For a time, it seemed that justice in some form had been served. Two of the men, believed to be responsible, were behind bars. The families of the victims felt a sense of relief, though nothing could ever bring their daughters back. The legal chapter of the yogurt shop murders appeared to be closed. However, the doubts about the case never fully went away. Many people, including legal experts and supporters of the convicted men, continued to believe that Scott and Springsteen were innocent. They maintained that the convictions were a miscarriage of justice, built on a foundation of coerced statements rather than solid proof. Appeals were immediately filed, setting the stage for years of further legal challenges. The verdicts did not bring the closure that everyone had hoped for. Instead, they added another layer of complexity and controversy to a case that had already torn the community apart, leaving a lingering sense of unease. As Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen sat in prison, their legal teams continued to fight for their freedom. Their best hope lay in the field of forensic science, which was advancing at a rapid pace. During the initial investigation in 1991, investigators had made a crucial decision. Against standard procedure at the time, they had taken a vaginal swab from one of the victims, Amy Ayers, at the crime scene before her body was moved. This small piece of evidence, carefully preserved for years, would ultimately change the entire trajectory of the case. It held the potential to either confirm the guilt of the convicted men or prove their innocence once and for all. In the early 2000s, new and more sensitive DNA testing methods became available. The defense teams pushed to have the evidence from the yogurt shop retested using this modern technology. Specifically, they focused on YSTR analysis, a technique that examines DNA found on the Y chromosome and is particularly useful for identifying male DNA in a mixed sample. The swab taken from Amy Ayers was sent to a private lab for analysis. The results were stunning. The lab was able to identify a complete DNA profile of an unknown male. This was a monumental breakthrough in the long-stalled case. The next step was to compare this newly discovered DNA profile to the DNA of the convicted men. The results were definitive. The unknown male DNA did not match Robert Springsteen. It did not match Michael Scott. It also did not match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn. Furthermore, it did not match any of the first responders or anyone known to have been at the crime scene. This was bombshell evidence. It proved that another man, someone who had never been identified, was present and had intimate contact with one of the victims. This physical evidence directly contradicted the confessions that had been the sole basis for the convictions. In light of this new DNA evidence, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the convictions of both Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen in 2009. After years in prison, both men were released. The prosecution, however, did not formally exonerate them. Instead, the charges were dismissed, leaving the men in a state of legal limbo, free, but with the specter of the crime still hanging over them. The DNA had cleared them from the crime scene, but it had not identified the true killer. The case was now back to square one, but with one crucial piece of evidence: the genetic fingerprint of an unknown man. Today, more than 3 decades after that horrific night, the yogurt shop murders remain an active cold case. The Austin Police Department has never given up on finding the person or people responsible. As of 2025, a dedicated detective, Dan Jackson, works on the case almost every day, driven by a commitment to the 4 girls and their families. The investigation now centers almost entirely on that small but powerful piece of evidence: the unknown male DNA profile recovered from the scene. The hope is that advances in forensic technology will finally allow investigators to put a name to that genetic code and solve the mystery once and for all. The field of forensic genealogy has emerged as a promising new avenue for investigators. This technique involves uploading the unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases to search for potential relatives of the perpetrator. By building family trees, investigators can narrow down the search and generate new leads. This method has been used to solve numerous cold cases across the country, and there's a strong belief that it could be the key to cracking the yogurt shop case. However, the process is complex and can be hampered by legal and privacy issues, as seen in reports that the FBI may have a match, but has been unable to share it. The long and painful history of the case has been brought back into the public eye recently, most notably with the premiere of a 4-part HBO docuseries in August 2025. Titled, the series meticulously revisited the crime, the flawed investigation, and the lasting impact on everyone involved. While it did not identify a new suspect, it renewed public interest and reminded a new generation of the quest for justice. It also served as a powerful call for anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to come forward. The police continue to ask for tips through Austin Crime Stoppers and a dedicated email address. For the detectives and the families, the search for truth is a marathon, not a sprint. It is a slow, painstaking process of re-examining old evidence, exploring new technologies, and never losing hope. The ultimate goal is to identify the man whose DNA was found on Amy Ayers, and to determine what role he played that night. Was he the sole killer, or was he one of several? These are the questions that still haunt investigators. The passage of time has not diminished their resolve. They are determined to one day provide the answers that the families have been waiting for over 30 years. The yogurt shop murders left an indelible scar on the city of Austin. In 1991, Austin was a growing city, but it still had a small-town feel, a place where people felt safe and communities were close-knit. The brutal killing of 4 young girls in a neighborhood yogurt shop shattered that sense of security forever. A wave of fear washed over the city as parents began to question the safety of their children, and the innocence of youth seemed to vanish overnight. The crime became a dark landmark in the city's history, a reference point for a time when everything changed. The memory of the murders still lingers, a shadow that is never fully lifted. For the families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy, the pain is a constant companion. They have navigated decades of grief, complicated by the twists and turns of a frustrating investigation and a flawed legal process. Barbara Ayers Wilson, the mother of Jennifer and Sarah, has spoken of the immense trauma of losing 2 daughters at once and the difficulty of reliving the horror with each new development or media inquiry. Eliza Thomas's sister, Sonora, was so profoundly affected by the tragedy that she became a therapist, dedicating her life to helping others cope with the kind of grief that has defined her own. Their lives were permanently altered, their futures rewritten by an act of senseless violence. The wrongful convictions of Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen added another layer of tragedy to the story. It meant that for nearly a decade, the community and the families believed the killers were behind bars, only to have that certainty ripped away. It also meant that 2 men lost years of their lives in prison for a crime they did not commit, a profound injustice that cannot be undone. The case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in police work, and the immense power of coerced confessions to derail the pursuit of truth, leaving justice elusive for everyone involved. Yet, amid the decades of pain and uncertainty, there remains a persistent and powerful hope. It is the hope that new technology will finally break the case open. It is the hope carried by the detectives who refuse to let the case go cold. And it is the hope held by the families that one day they will have answers and the person responsible will be held accountable. The search for justice for Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah continues, fueled by the love of their families and the collective memory of a city that will never forget them. Their 4 bright lights were extinguished far too soon, but the quest to honor their memory endures.